Good morning. Welcome to CGSR in our continuing nuclear crossroads series here. And today I have the very great honor of welcoming Karim Sadjadpour to the laboratory. He's a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and has a particularly unique and deep experience on Iran and U.S.-Iranian relations. Some of you may have seen him on TV. So now I also want to point out that what he's going to talk about today was this week's cover story in The Economist, but we can't take credit for that, unfortunately. Anyway, let me ask Tristan, who is the heart and soul of this Nuclear Crossroads series and does all of the heavy lifting and carrying for it, to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm Tristan Volpe, and on behalf of the Center for Global Security Research, let me welcome you back to the Nuclear Crossroads Speaker Series. So over the last few months, we've heard from a number of the leading experts and individuals on strategic nuclear policy and nuclear proliferation. It's my great pleasure to continue this tradition with Karim Sadjadpour from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. As one of the foremost public experts on Iran, Karim is a frequent contributor to CNN, BBC, NPR, PBS NewsHour, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Fox News, and most notably, has appeared twice on The Colbert Report. He contributes to all major news periodicals, briefs U.S., European, and Asian officials about Middle Eastern affairs, testifies before Congress, and currently teaches at Georgetown University. Karim has also published 2 must-read manuscripts that explore the worldview of Iran's supreme leader, as well as the costs and risks of Iran's nuclear odyssey over the last 3 decades. Both are available for free to download from Carnegie's website. We are therefore very fortunate this morning to have Karim here with us to examine the current and future state of play in U.S.-Iranian relations as negotiations over Iran's nuclear program enter the final endgame in Vienna starting tomorrow. Even if both sides reach a comprehensive deal, it is not clear whether this positive step is enough to put U.S.-Iranian relations on a new path forward. As Karim once mentioned to me, you can't judge the success of a marriage like this based solely on the wedding. So rather than speculate on just the likelihood or the modalities of a potential deal, Karim is going to take a step back and embed the nuclear issue within the overall political relationship between these 2 longtime rivals. Because this talk is obviously videotaped, it is unclassified, and I would like to welcome Karim to the stage to give this presentation. Karim?
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Tristan, for the generous introduction. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Tristan, but he's someone who has incredibly bright future, I think, in whatever he chooses to do, whether in policy or in government. My talk today is about the nuclear issue, about U.S.-Iran relations. I think the title of the talk is Conciliation, Reconciliation, or Conflict, which is an evergreen title. It's a title I've been using, I think, the last decade. It's always in the past appeared that it was closer to conflict than reconciliation, but I think in recent months it's looks somewhat more optimistic, so we can talk about that. And I jumped at the opportunity to come here not to talk, but to really learn and listen from all of you. So I'll keep my remarks relatively brief, and I look forward to the interaction. So I think any U.S. policy discussion on Iran is nicely framed, nicely bookended by 2 quotes from the great Bavarian intellectual Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. Kissinger once said in his book, Does America Need a Foreign Policy? This is a verbatim quote. He said, quote, "There are few nations in the world with whom the United States has more common interests and less reason to quarrel than Iran." But he said something subsequent to that which I thought was quite brilliant in its simplicity. He said that Iran has to decide whether it's a nation or a cause. If it sees itself as a nation, it pursues its national interests. As he said, there's tremendous overlapping interests between the United States and Iran. But if Iran continues to see itself as a revolutionary cause in opposition to America, in opposition to Israel, we're going to continue to butt heads. So what I wanted to start today was to talk a little bit about the political context within Tehran and this debate between those who want to continue to see Iran as a revolutionary cause and those who want to start to prioritize national interests over revolutionary ideology. Because I think this really shapes the way you think about the nuclear conflict and about Iran's role in the Middle East as well. So I think it's useful to rewind to the year 1989. 1989 was a very eventful year globally. It was the year in which the Berlin Wall fell. But in Iran, 1989 was a seminal year as well because it was the year in which the father of the 1979 revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini, died. And after Khomeini died, there was the revolutionary elite who inherited power in the Islamic Republic were essentially divided into two groups. There are folks that I call the pragmatists, people like former President Hashemi Rafsanjani, who loyal soldiers of the revolution, but they believed that in order to preserve the revolution, in order to preserve the Islamic Republic, Iran needed to start to prioritize economic interests and national interests ahead of revolutionary ideology. And the model that these folks had in mind and have in mind for Iran is China. And many people have charitably compared Rafsanjani, but even Rouhani now, Hassan Rouhani, who is a protege of Rafsanjani, to the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, starting to prioritize economic interests before revolutionary ideology. And the idea is that we'll continue to keep political power for ourselves, but we'll open up the country economically, and we'll, as I said, start to put our economic interests first. And the opposite school of thought in Tehran, we oftentimes refer to them as the hardliners. They refer to themselves as the principalists. And these are individuals who believe that the principles of the 1979 revolution are sacrosanct. And they're led by the current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And their retort to these pragmatists is to say, listen, look at what happened when Gorbachev tried to reform the Soviet Union. Once you start to compromise on your principles, on your ideals, that's when the entire system can unravel and the roof can collapse on top of us. And so what you've had in Iran since 1989 has been this broad debate between those who hope Iran can become like China and those who fear Iran could end up like the Soviet Union. And the prior decade in Iran, the decade of President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, we saw the principalists firmly in charge. They controlled almost all branches of government, the presidency, the parliament, the military, the media. And we saw where that took Iran, to unprecedented political and economic isolation. And so what we saw last year with the election of Hassan Rouhani was kind of a course correction of sorts. A recognition on the part of some that if Iran continued to kind of prioritize revolutionary ideology before national interests, the country was going to be slowly bankrupted, and the regime and the revolution would be in peril. So what we saw with Rouhani's election was the return of these so-called pragmatic figures. And I don't refer to them as reformists because they're, as I said, they're not interested in really in pursuing political reform. They're not interested in democratizing Iran, but they're interested in kind of preserving the Islamic Republic by strengthening the country's economy. And so we saw that the election of Rouhani has had an impact on the nuclear negotiations with the United States. You all of a sudden have a group of much more pragmatic figures, pragmatic diplomats, who appear interested in reaching some type of a resolution to this nuclear conflict. But the challenge which remains in Iran is the fact that the hardline figures, the principalists, led by the supreme leader, continue to control the main levers of power. They continue to maintain control over the Revolutionary Guards, who really oversee Iran's nuclear program. They still have control over the parliament, over many powerful branches in the media, judiciary. So I would argue that despite this emergence of the pragmatists in the office of the presidency, it's still going to be a heavy lift for them to deliver a nuclear deal. So let me move on to talk about what I see as the three potential outcomes of these nuclear talks, which at the moment have a November 24th deadline, but I think they could possibly be extended. So outcome number one is a resolution to these nuclear talks, to reach a comprehensive nuclear deal. And I think this is an ideal outcome for President Obama, for Secretary Kerry. I don't know if you saw in some leaked remarks which came out in the last few days, one of President Obama's advisors said that this nuclear deal for Obama is like healthcare. It's like the foreign policy equivalent of healthcare. It's something that he really hopes to secure his legacy and bank his foreign policy legacy upon. So it's something which I think the White House, the State Department is desperately trying to reach. And some of you are probably more familiar with the obstacles to reaching a comprehensive resolution than I am. There's big differences of opinion on how many centrifuges Iran should be allowed, the future of some of these sites which began clandestinely, like the Fordow facility outside of Qom, the degree of transparency. There's a lot of obstacles to reaching that deal. And I've always thought that one of the chief obstacles from Iran's vantage point is the fact that you have, as I said, these kind of hardline figures like the Supreme Leader who arguably see nuclear resolution as inimical to their domestic political interests. I think it's well established that you have in Iran the most pro-American society in today's Middle East. It's very much kind of post-ideological society, which is desperately interested in emerging from political and economic isolation. And in the event of a comprehensive nuclear deal, it's very much thought that this would strengthen the hand of those pragmatists who've long argued for a more conciliatory approach towards the West. And it would certainly raise the expectations of society, which is interested not only in a nuclear deal, but a broader political accommodation between the United States and Iran, rapprochement between the two countries. And so I think that if you're a hardliner in Tehran, if you're the Supreme Leader, I think it's an open question whether a nuclear deal is in your national interests, or I should say, in your own personal interests, or it's inimical to your interests. I would argue for the hardliners in Tehran, they've long prioritized kind of their own parochial political interests before the economic welfare of the country. So I think that the odds of reaching a resolution, despite the fact that the more recent media reports have been positive, I would say the odds of reaching a resolution are still pretty high because of the fact that you have, the people who have to sign off on this deal in Tehran don't necessarily see the deal as in their own parochial interests. So option number two, if we don't reach a comprehensive resolution, is, for lack of a better term, escalation, a return to status quo ante. And given all the crises that are happening in today's world, it's tough to imagine we have the bandwidth for yet another conflict in the Middle East. But I think it's easy to see how a conflict is potentially triggered. And I can walk you through it. So come November 24th, we fail to reach a comprehensive resolution. And many members of Congress would argue that the only reason Iran is negotiating in a serious way right now is precisely because of the very onerous economic sanctions and economic coercion which was passed by Congress. And so therefore, if Iran is unwilling to compromise, if Iran is unwilling to make kind of meaningful and binding nuclear compromises, then the answer is to pass additional sanctions, to kind of force Iran to negotiate, to force Iran to compromise. And I think, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A session, given the rightward shift of Congress, that's only, that point of view has only been accentuated in the last days. And my own sense is that rather than force Iran to capitulate, what's more likely if we pass additional sanctions is that Iran will react by saying, okay, you've abrogated your end of the deal, so we're no longer going to keep our car pulled over to the side of the road. We're going to reconstitute and recommence our nuclear activities and kind of put their foot on the accelerator again. And this takes us back to status quo ante, a situation in which we've escalated with greater economic sanctions. Iran is now escalating by moving forward with the program. I don't think they make a mad dash for a weapon, but they continue they recommence doing things that we stopped them from doing in the interim deal. And I think this puts us into a very uncomfortable situation of having to once again contemplate military action. If you recall in Obama's first term, he said that he doesn't have a policy of containing a nuclear armed Iran, he has a policy of preventing nuclear armed Iran. And what's kind of implicit or explicit in that is that if faced with a binary choice of taking military action or allowing Iran to get a nuclear weapon, he would pursue the former route. But I think that even those of us on the outside can clearly observe that this president is not interested in military conflict in the Middle East, another military conflict in the Middle East. And I think that's certainly an accurate reflection of the public mood as well, that the public is not interested in a military conflict, another military conflict in the Middle East. So I think there is this tension, and it's a debate which I think really hasn't been fully probed among members of Congress. On one hand, they believe that further coercion and sanctions may well be necessary in order to force Iran into a compromise. But what happens the day after that, I think they're not fully, that question really hasn't been fully probed. So let me talk about the third option. I said the first option is a comprehensive resolution. I see the odds of that is not great. The second option is escalation. That's something which President Obama is not interested in. And it's something which Hassan Rouhani, president of Iran, is not interested in because he's kind of he's put all of his political capital into reaching a nuclear deal. So he's interested in a deal. So the third outcome I call, for lack of a better term, managed irresolution. And basically what it is we failed to reach a deal come November 24th, but there's a recognition in both capitals, both Washington and Tehran, that it doesn't behoove either side to go to option number 2, which is return to status quo ante, return to escalation. And it's it's more or less an extension of the interim deal. So to use that kind of automobile analogy, we've gotten Iran to pull its car over to the side of the road. It's kind of stopped doing some of the things which we found most problematic. And so you try to lock in the compromises which Iran has currently made and prevent them from further moving forward. But it's not a policy of trying to force them to move backwards. And I think if you're President Obama, you have two priorities vis-a-vis Iran from now until the end of your term, January 2017. You want to avert an Iranian bomb, and you want to avert bombing Iran. Right? You want to prevent Iran from going nuclear, but you also want to prevent the possibility of another war in the Middle East. So I think that managed irresolution or an extension of the interim deal is an imperfect outcome for Obama, but it's preferable to a return to status quo ante-escalation. And if you're the supreme leader in Tehran, the option of managed irresolution is actually not a bad one. Because what essentially happens is that further sanctions, you avoid further sanctions and further economic isolation. But at the same time, there isn't a deal which potentially strengthens the hand of your domestic adversaries, the pragmatists who have long argued for a more conciliatory approach. So of these three options, I've always thought from the day the interim deal was signed that this kind of option of managed irresolution may be the least bad option for all parties. And really the challenge of reaching this deal is not finding an agreement between Obama and Hassan Rouhani in Tehran. I think if it was only up to them, we would have probably reached a resolution long ago. But the challenge of reaching an agreement is finding a consensus, drafting a document which gets the blessing of two institutions and two individuals. The two institutions are the US Congress and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, and the two individuals are the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and Bibi Netanyahu in Tel Aviv. And others would argue that you don't need to have the support, or at least the acquiescence of the Israeli Prime Minister. But I think if it's going to be a lasting deal, something that, to go back to the analogy that Tristan and I talked about, a marriage, not just a wedding, if you have vociferous opposition from the Prime Minister of Israel, I think it becomes much more difficult for Congress to support such a deal. And frankly, as we're nearing presidential election season, I think both candidates from the Republican and Democratic side will have a much tougher time supporting this nuclear deal if you have vociferous opposition from both the Israeli Prime Minister and Congress. So that's the kind of the nuclear context I wanted to talk about, and I'm very happy to kind of go back and revisit some of these points. But I thought it was also useful to talk about the context of talk about U.S.-Iran relations in the regional context, and going back to the framework of the pragmatists and the principalists, the pragmatists and the hardliners in Tehran. Iran is integral to at least half a dozen major U.S. national security challenges in the Middle East. You have Syria, which has become perhaps the most urgent U.S. Foreign policy concern at the moment. Given Iran's support for President Bashar al-Assad, they've made themselves integral to that issue. Absent Iran's military and financial support, it's likely that Assad would have fallen a long time ago. Iran is integral to both the futures of Iraq and Afghanistan. Given its long and porous borders with both Iraq and Afghanistan, it's absent a more cooperative role from Iran, it's going to be very difficult to see lasting stability in both those countries. Iran is integral to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, given its support for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Absent a more cooperative role from Iran, it's going to be very difficult to reach some type of a consensus on that issue, and likewise the issue of terrorism. Iran is also integral, although increasingly less integral, to the issue of energy security. Given this is one of the things we can revisit in the questions. Given America's indigenous energy bonanza, we're becoming increasingly less reliant on Middle East oil. But Iran has the world's largest reserves of gas, world's second, or I should say fourth largest reserves of oil. So it's integral to the issue of energy security. And so I think that if you take this into account in your President Obama, you quickly come to the realization that shunning Iran is not an option. You can't really avoid Iran if you want to ameliorate any of these national security challenges, because, as I said, it has an integral role in so many of them, so many Middle Eastern conflicts. And military conflict with Iran would likely exacerbate all of these issues. So the option you're left with is to try to dialogue and engage with Iran to ameliorate these issues. The perennial challenge we've had in our dealings with Iran is the fact that the pragmatists whom we talk to, people like Foreign Minister Zarif, to some extent President Rouhani, the pragmatists whom we talk to can't deliver. And the hardliners, those who can deliver, don't talk to us. So the Supreme Leader hasn't left Iran since 1989. He has had no contact with US officials. The Revolutionary Guards, who really oversee Iran's role in the Middle East, and their famous commander, Qasem Soleimani, they don't meet with US officials. And so, again, the challenge is the people who are running Iranian policy in the Middle East don't talk to us. And the people whom we do interact with in nuclear talks and in other negotiations, people like the foreign minister, don't really call the shots on Middle East policy. And for that reason, despite kind of a more conciliatory rhetoric from Iran, we really haven't seen substantive change in Iran's foreign policy in the Middle East. I'll just say a couple words about Syria, given the importance of the topic. 3 years ago, it was becoming conventional wisdom that the Assad regime is on the verge of collapse. They'll soon be falling. The top US government expert on Syria declared Bashar al-Assad to be a dead man walking. And what we've seen since then is Iran doubling and tripling down on their financial and military support for Assad, and Assad really gaining strength, significant strength vis-a-vis the Syrian rebels, the Syrian opposition. And I think now you increasingly have, major foreign policy heavyweights in the United States, eminent decorated diplomats, people like Ryan Crocker, who was once ambassador to Syria, arguing that as bad as Bashar al-Assad is, the alternative to him could be worse. Some of these radical Sunni jihadist groups who form a strong part of the rebellion are arguably worse than Assad. So if you're the Islamic Republic of Iran reading that, you don't think to yourself that you're soon going to have to compromise on your support for Assad. I think there's a growing sense in Tehran that the West, the outside world, the United States, is gradually resigning themselves to Iran's position on Syria rather than vice versa. So I think that Iran feels somewhat emboldened in the regional policy. And to tie this to the nuclear issue, I think there's a great deal of hope that if we're able to reach a nuclear deal with Iran, it will compel Iran to play a more conciliatory role in the Middle East. That kind of US-Iran cooperation on the nuclear issue could bring about more US-Iran cooperation on regional issues. We haven't really seen any evidence of that in the last 3.5 decades in US-Iran relations. For the principalists, they see kind of rejection of American influence in the Middle East and the rejection of Israel's existence as arguably inextricable parts of the Islamic Republic's identity. And so I would argue that if past this precedent, what could be more likely to happen in the event of a nuclear deal or even in the event of some type of a managed resolution, if Iran receives some sanctions relief or some of their assets are unfrozen, I would argue that that makes it somewhat easier for them to do what they're doing in the Middle East, which is continued financial support for the Assad regime, continued financial support for groups like Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad. I don't see any evidence that that is going to compel Iran to change long-standing strategic principles. If you remember, there was a period in Iran from 1997 to 2005 where you did see a reformist president, Mohammad Khatami, who was talking about dialogue of civilizations, who was interested in US-Iran détente. And despite that, you didn't really see any change in Iran's regional policies. And I think that this time around, I see things quite similarly, in that the rhetoric, in contrast to the Ahmadinejad years, when you had President Ahmadinejad denying the Holocaust and constantly issuing bombastic comments. The rhetoric from President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif has improved significantly. But in terms of kind of substantive Iranian policies in the region, we really haven't seen a strong shift. And instead of, I think that what I'd like to do now is to go back to kind of the domestic situation in Iran, and instead of talking about kind of the immediate term, to talk a little bit about more the medium term and long term, because I guess my basic assessment is that until you have a change in Iranian leadership at the very top, meaning a different supreme leader, I don't really see a strategic shift in Iran's nuclear approach or a strategic shift in Iran's regional policies. We may see some tactical shifts, and we have seen somewhat of a tactical shift on the nuclear file. They overreached and they've backed up a little bit, but I don't see it as a strategic shift, a decision on the part of Iran's leaders to pursue a fundamentally different course, to pursue, as I said, that China model. And so, with the supreme leader is now 75 years old. Unfortunately, mullahs seem to have a very long lifespan, much more than other civilians in Iran. If you look at societal dynamics in Iran, I think there's good reason to be hopeful. And there's a wonderful anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, which I think nicely captures Iranian society. And this was during the Cold War. It was in the 1950s. And the king of Cambodia was contemplating where to send his son for university. And the options he was thinking about were Moscow State University or the Sorbonne in Paris. And so he thought about it for a couple of days, and he said, after much thought, I've decided to send my son, the prince, to study at Moscow State University. And his aides were quite perplexed that, why would you want to do that? And he said, well, if I send him to the Sorbonne, he'll become a communist. And I think what that reflected then was that those who didn't have to live under communist governments really romanticized communism. Those who lived under communist regimes didn't romanticize it. And I think that applies to Islamism now. Those who live under authoritarian Islamist governments like the Islamic Republic of Iran, they don't romanticize joining mosque and state the same way you may romanticize that if you live in a place like Egypt or in Syria or elsewhere. Kind of what distinguishes Iran from much of the Arab world. In the Arab world, you have kind of secular dictatorships ruling over traditional societies. And in Iran, you have a traditional dictatorship, Islamist dictatorship, ruling over an increasingly secular society. And again, it's by virtue of the fact that people in Iran have been living under the system for 3.5 decades. And I think Tom Friedman put it well. He said, Iranians have seen enough Islamism to know they want less of it, and enough democracy to know they want more of it. So there's good reasons to be hopeful about society in Iran. But the reality is that you have a revolutionary elite which has a monopoly of coercion, and they really have nowhere else to go. In 1978, there was this seminal moment when the Shah of Iran's regime was collapsing before his eyes. He went on state television and he apologized to his public. He apologized to people for past sins and transgressions. And he very famously said to them, he said, I've heard the voice of your revolution. And I found a quote once from the current Supreme Leader Khamenei, who said that the Shah thought that by going on television and apologizing to us, to the revolutionaries, that he was going to pacify us, and we were just going to kind of accept that apology and go home and stop protesting. But he said that that's when we saw how vulnerable he is, how defeated he looked, and we we smelled blood and we pounced. And many of the Shah's military and political elite studied in places like, they studied it in the United States and Europe and Canada. So as the Shah's regime began to crumble, when the going got tough, they could remake their lives elsewhere. They either had foreign educations or foreign passports, and they jumped off the sinking ship. The Islamic Republic, in contrast, is led by a political military elite who really haven't studied abroad. They don't have foreign passports, and they don't have really great options in terms of where they can go if the Islamic Republic of Iran were ever to fall. And so for that reason, we've seen that whenever there's been any popular uprising, rather than offer any ground like the Shah offered, they immediately try to nip it in the bud, to crush it. That's partly because they believe that you should never compromise when you're being pressured, because compromise just doesn't alleviate the pressure, it projects weakness and invites more pressure. But it's, as I said, in great part also due to the fact that they realize they have no greater options. They have no, if you're a senior Iranian cleric, where can you go if the Islamic Republic falls? Your only regional ally, Syria, is in an incredibly precarious situation. You don't speak foreign languages. You don't have a foreign education. So there's not great options. And I say all this by way of saying that you have a government which is very much willing to kill and die to stay in power. And it doesn't take that many people to control a large population, 70, 75 million. I think as long as you maintain this monopoly of coercion, and you give the people who have the monopoly of coercion, the Revolutionary Guards, you give them a financial stake in maintaining the status quo. We've seen, they're willing to, in 2009, during the big protests in Iran, they were willing to kill and die for this regime. And you have a population which is not interested in becoming martyrs, right? They're not interested in becoming, they're not interested in fighting a jihad in the same way we see some of these other popular uprisings in the Middle East, namely in Syria, where you have the Syrian rebels. They encompass everything from kind of secular intellectuals, secular nationalists to Al-Qaeda. It's an incredibly wide spectrum. In Iran, the opposition and those who are discontent with the Islamic Republic, I would say, are a wide mass of people, arguably even the majority of Iranian society, but they're not willing to go out in the streets and get killed, or certainly to kill. The line I sometimes use is that in 1979, Iran had a revolution without democracy, and today people are interested in a democracy without a revolution. And so I think that will likely require, we're looking at a kind of a long-term evolutionary process in Iran. I don't see, I'm not hopeful about the prospect of some type of abrupt change. But on a political level, I should just add as well that if you're a 22-year-old kid living in Iran, you experienced the brutal beatdown in 2009 when you tried to rise up against the Islamic Republic, and also you look on your television set and you see what's happening in Syria, you see what's happening kind of in the other tumultuous environments in the region, and you may want to see change, but you're fearful of that type of anarchy and civil war. So I think, as I said, people have revolutionary ends in Iran. They want to see really substantial change, but they're not willing to pursue revolutionary means. And so for that reason, I think when we start to see a change in the Islamic Republic's nuclear and regional policies, it will most likely come at the top when there's a change in the top leader and in the supreme leader. And there's a lot of speculation now about the health of the supreme leader, because he recently had prostate surgery. There's a lot of speculation about who would succeed him. In 1989, months before Khomeini was going to die, if you asked people in Iran who was most likely to succeed him, Khamenei wouldn't have been one of the top 5 or 10 choices. So now it's very difficult to speculate. But at the moment, the people, the person who's mentioned more than others is the former head of the judiciary, a guy called Ayatollah Shahrudi. He's someone who, in contrast to Khamenei, is a bona fide Ayatollah. So he has both kind of prominent religious credentials and prominent political credentials. He was someone who managed the bureaucracy for many years, managed the judiciary, so he's used to kind of working in the Islamic Republic political environment. But I see, what is equally likely in Iran is that over the course of the last decade or two, what we've seen is the emergence of the Revolutionary Guards and the emergence of the military and really kind of the institution of the Revolutionary Guards eclipsing the institution of the clergy as the major power broker in Iran. And, if you're thinking about democracy and human rights, this isn't a great thing because the Revolutionary Guards are, military governments probably everywhere have never been great supporters of democracy and human rights. But I would say that in contrast to some of the hardline principalists who are in power, my interactions with members of the Revolutionary Guard when I was based in Tehran was that they were oftentimes actually much more pragmatic than civilian counterparts. These were men who served in war, served in the Iran-Iraq War. They kind of appreciate the logic of power sometimes more than their civilian counterparts. And so when we talk about an Iran which starts to see itself as more China than the Soviet Union, prioritizing economic interests before national interests, before ideological interests, kind of a transition to a more military-style government could actually hasten that transition of prioritizing economic national interests before ideological interests. So why don't I end there, and very happy to go into further discussion on all of these issues. Thank you. Okay, sure.
Questions?
Yes, hi. Pardon me. So the impression that I have, first of all, is that I'm in so much violent agreement with your analysis that I find myself baffled by your conclusions. I see, just like you do, that fanatics are in power and are willing to die and kill to stay in power. For that reason, I don't see how, of the 3 outcomes likely outcomes that you outline, why are nuclear agreement or managed disagreement the 2 better ones? I've seen nuclear agreement with the rogue regime in my lifetime. Euphoric nuclear agreement in the mid-90s in North Korea.
Yeah.
Within 5 years, they had a bomb. And in this case, unlike North Korea, which needed a bomb to pound their chest, these guys say openly that they need a bomb to kill millions of Jews. And if they will have it within 5 years of agreement or violent non-agreement, I don't see, or managed non-agreement, I don't see how the Holocaust that would follow would be justified by aversion to tough actions.
Should I go one by one? Okay, that's a great question, very thoughtful question. I mean, what Iranian leaders openly say is not that they want to attain nuclear weapons to annihilate Israel, but they've always consistently said that they're not interested in having a nuclear weapon. And in fact, there's religious fatwa against nuclear weapons. Now, I'm as dubious about that as I see you are. But I would argue that if I had to take a guess in terms of what Iran's endgame is on this nuclear issue, I would first say that I don't think they themselves know what their endgame is. I think this has been a lot of ad hocery, and it's based on the economic circumstances of the country, based on what is found out by foreign intelligence agencies. But if I had to take a gander in terms of kind of what the broad endgame is, I would say that they're interested in having nuclear weapons capability. The analogy which is most commonly used is Japan. I know people have real problems with comparing Iran to Japan, but in the sense that it's a regime which wants to be a screwdriver turned away from having weapons, but isn't interested in a kind of a North Korean endgame. And so, but I guess that I should take a step back and say that based on your assessment of the Iranian regime, the nature of the Iranian regime, that really dictates what the policy should be. And the three historic analogies which are most commonly made with the Islamic Republic of Iran, I mentioned two of them. China, that this is simply, it's an authoritarian regime, but it's pragmatic, and if we engage them, we can bring about some type of a rapprochement, Nixon to China. The other analogy I mentioned is the Soviet Union. I'm not talking about in terms of the scale of Iranian power, but the nature of the Iranian system. That ultimately this regime isn't pragmatic. It's deeply ideological, and it needs us as an adversary. This is my assessment of Iran, that you can't reach an accommodation with a regime which needs you as an adversary for their own internal legitimacy. And the third analogy, which I think is maybe closer to your point of view, and it's certainly the reflection, this is what Prime Minister Netanyahu has articulated as well, is that no, this regime is not pragmatic, it's deeply ideological, and it's messianic. They can't be deterred just with economic coercion, and it's 1938 all over again. It's Nazi Germany, and so based on one's kind of assessment of the nature of the Iranian regime, I think that really dictates the policy. I think people in the Bush administration were closer to the latter point of view, that this government is messianic and it's undeterrable, and therefore we really need to think seriously about military action. I would argue that the Obama administration is closer to kind of analogies 1 and 2. Is it China? Is it the Soviet Union? Can we reach a deal with them? And if we can't reach a deal with them, that will simply expose the fact that the problem lies in Tehran, not Washington, and then we can continue to isolate them even more. And again, I have to, I think as you saw in my remarks, I guess this is where we differ. I think that the Islamic Republic of Iran is homicidal but not suicidal. What's paramount for them is to remain in power, and I think if they were ever to use nuclear weapons, I think that would be the end of the Islamic. That would be arguably the end of Iran as we know it. So my sense about the supreme leader, again, he's been in power for 25 years. And there's an old saying about revolutionaries, and that is that you're a revolutionary until you gain power, and then you become a conservative because you want to conserve what you have. And I think again for this supreme leader, his goal is to stay in power, and the question is what's the best way to preserve that power? I would argue that it's neither conciliation or that. I think rapprochement with the United States would be far more dangerous to the supreme leader than a reconciliation with the United States. I was telling Tristan and others earlier that in America we say that the first rule of politics is know your base. Know whom your constituents are. Well, the supreme leader's constituents, the supreme leader's base, are those folks who have been attending Friday prayer sessions the last 2.5 decades singing "Death to America." And so, he can't be the champion of the secular, urban sophisticates in Iran. He knows who his base is, and so therefore I don't see him deviating from this hardline view vis-a-vis the United States. But at the same time, I think there is a recognition on his part that obtaining nuclear device, it's incredibly fraught with, the path to getting there is incredibly fraught with risk. And then actually, using a device would be unbelievably risky if you're him. And if your goal is to stay in power, I don't see how that furthers that. Please. He wanted to.
Just, you allow me to follow up?
Please.
this is very good and thoughtful analysis if his policy is all Earth-based. What if he actually believes what he says? What
If his policy is what?
Is Earth-based?
Yeah.
What if he believes his religious dogma? What if he believes in Shiite messianism and bring about the 13th Imam through apocalypse? I mean, is that, why is it so hard to believe that people mean what they say?
No, I actually am very much a textualist when it comes to, especially when it comes to this leader in particular. If we were talking about Ahmadinejad, I would say, there's this old joke from Groucho Marx. He said, "These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I got some other ones for you." Ahmadinejad was very willing to change principles, but this leader has had a very consistent message for 2.5 decades. And if we take him at face value, just on the nuclear issue, what he's said consistently is that he's opposed to having nuclear weapons because it's against Islam. He's issued this fatwa against it. Now, I don't take that at face value per se, but it doesn't corroborate your assessment that he's interested in an apocalypse. And I mean, he doesn't talk in apocalyptic language. Ahmadinejad sometimes did, but the supreme leader really hasn't. And again, we've seen over the course, if you just look at the nuclear conflict of the last decade, it's not that they've been driving their car 100 miles an hour in the direction of a nuclear weapon. I mean, if that really was their only goal to have a nuclear weapon, this is the assessment of US intelligence agencies, that it's now a political decision for them, not a technical decision. They have kind of the technical wherewithal if they actually want to do it, but it's been a political decision not to. And that's been his decision, the Supreme Leader's decision. So again, I appreciate your skepticism of the leader. I guess where we would just differ is that I don't see him as someone who is interested in kind of using nuclear weapons in order to preserve his power. I see him believing that having the capability is a much better way for him to preserve his power.
In the back.
So, in view of the fracking boom in the United States and falling oil prices worldwide, which I would argue will do a lot more to bring Iran to the negotiating table than any sanctions would, and the fact that China and Russia have now agreed with Iran to build a infrastructure for trading oil, which will sort of basically completely subvert the sanctions. What do you see as the end game of a contained disagreement policy? Because I worry that you put too much emphasis on individual figures in Iran as opposed to the country as a whole.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and so what I said in my remarks was that the economic welfare of the Iranian population has never been a first or even second-tier priority for those who rule the country. If the economic welfare of the population was the top priority of Iran's leaders, we would have reached a nuclear deal a long time ago, because this program doesn't make any sense in the context of Iran's, in the context of economic expediency. This is just kind of an aside, but Frank von Hippel, whom I'm sure is known to many of you, a physicist at Princeton, when I was first beginning to work on this issue, he kind of was explaining to me how if Iran were to import LEU from abroad, it would be as much as a tenth of the cost of enriching it indigenously. And he said, imagine that you want your citizens to drive Honda Civics. But instead of importing each car from Japan for $10,000, you insist on making it at home for $100,000. He said, that wouldn't make any sense if you were talking about in the context of automobiles, but that's something which I think is not well understood by the Iranian public. But back to the issue of how the falling price of oil may impact the dynamics. my sense is that the person who was who arguably deserves the most credit for the effectiveness of the sanctions regime and Iran's political and economic isolation was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. He was really our greatest ally in sanctioning and isolating Iran, because much of the outside world kind of reached the conclusion that the problem lies in Tehran more than Washington. You have a U.S. President, Obama, who really bent over backwards in his first 4 years in office to try to reach some type of an accommodation with Iran, but we were rebuffed. So we've seen tremendous international buy-in in the sanctions regime. We've essentially forced the major companies and countries in the world to make a simple choice, and that is, do you prefer to do business in America or do you prefer to do business in Iran? And vast majority of major companies and countries would obviously prefer doing business with America. So at the moment, Iran's oil resource, about 80% of Iran's export revenue comes from oil, and that revenue has been cut by more than half. This was a country which, in 1977, at its peak, Iran was producing about 6 million barrels per day. The Islamic Republic, under Islamic Republic, that number came down to about 4.2 million barrels per day. But under sanctions, that number has dropped to around 2.5. So it's been cut by about half. And then the exports have also dropped precipitously. At one point, it reached less than 1 million barrels per day export. This was a country which was at one point exporting 2.5 million barrels per day. And not only did the export of oil become far more difficult for Iran, but the oil which they exported, it became far more difficult for them to receive payment on that because of the financial sanctions. So it's a country which is, is burning the candle on one end because of the lost oil production, and is burning the candle on the other end, having to send hundreds of millions of dollars to Syria to buoy the Assad regime. So you see why, in my opinion, they were forced to come to the nuclear negotiating table. But I still don't see, my sense, and I could be wrong, we'll see in a few weeks, is that in the context of a managed irresolution, they feel like they'll be able to continue to muddle through. You mentioned that it behooves us not to focus only on specific individuals when we're thinking about Iran, and I think that's a very good point. But really, when it comes to the nuclear issue, I don't think that society really has had any vote on whether it's the Iranian government's nuclear policies or the Iranian government's role in the Middle East. I think if you were to poll Iranian people and say, would you rather send $500 million a month to Bashar al-Assad, or would you rather use that money for schools and hospitals in Iran? It would be no-brainer. And likewise, if you said to people, would you rather have a few thousand additional centrifuges, or would you rather have tens of billions of dollars worth of sanction relief and re-enter the global political and global economy? It would be a no-brainer. But you have kind of a small minority of folks who are making those decisions. And it seems to me that if we fail to reach an agreement come November 24th, because these very figures I'm talking about see it as inimical to their domestic interests, I think they may calculate that in the event of an impasse, international unity isn't going to be what it was during the Ahmadinejad era. That a lot of these countries, and you mentioned China and Russia, and even some European countries, will say to themselves that we're not going to continue to forsake our own commercial and strategic interests vis-a-vis Iran simply to placate the US Congress. And my sense is that the Obama administration, in order to maintain this managed irresolution, they're not going to lift sanctions to incentivize Iran, because they can't do that, because Iran hasn't really done the requisite compromises needed to lift sanctions. But one way of getting Iran to keep its foot on the nuclear brake is to stop it enforcing existing sanctions. So you may have China starting to import 100, 200,000 additional barrels per day. Maybe the Indians start to do that as well. Japan, South Korea. And that doesn't take Iran back to status quo ante in terms of its oil production and output, but it's additional 300, 400, 500,000 barrels per day, which allows them to continue to kind of muddle through. And again, my sense, and I have to say, it's been my experience talking not only to Chinese and Russian officials, but even European officials who, and countries very close to the United States who say behind closed doors that, listen, Rouhani and Zarif are much more reasonable individuals than some of our allies in the region. They will compare Rouhani favorably to Erdogan in Turkey or to King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. So it's my sense that even a lot of countries in Europe are going to argue that we need to, we can't. Iran is too important in the country to shun, to politically and economically isolate. We need engagement with Iran. And so what does that do for, I think what essentially does is that it's a win-win in that, if you're Obama, you've avoided those two outcomes which I talked about. You averted a nuclear-armed Iran and you averted war with Iran. And if you're the supreme leader, you've averted a deal which could potentially strengthen your domestic adversaries, but you're improving the economy somewhat. Again, you're not totally removing the sanctions and re-emerging from isolation. But I don't think that's what he's interested in doing. One of the things which I think we often times lose sight of when it comes to these authoritarian leaders, whether it's Castro in Cuba or Kim Jong-un in North Korea, I think they're shrewd enough to appreciate that they oftentimes they understand that they can preserve their power much easier in a closed context, in a closed environment. And if this supreme leader genuinely believed that it would be in his interest to restore relations with the United States, there's no better opportunity for him to do so than right now. You have President Obama and Secretary Kerry who are desperate for not only a nuclear détente with Iran, but a broader political accommodation. So I think if he was genuinely interested in that outcome, he would have done that long ago. So I see this kind of muddling through option is perhaps the most palatable option for him, and it's something which is acceptable to Obama.
Up front.
You use the analogy that basically the car being pulled over to the side of the road for the nuclear program in Iran, and I guess I question, how do we really know that that car is actually pulled over to the side of the road, and isn't it still moving forward at a slow but consistent pace, regardless of whether the negotiations are going on or even if we're in this muddled state, that they'll continue to move forward and eventually achieve that nuclear weapon, which is the end game, which obviously Israel and the rest of the world should be very fearful of.
Yeah. The challenge I have in this talk is that a lot of you probably have access to information which I don't, which kind of maybe disproves some of the thoughts I've thrown out there. I was saying earlier that someone I know who very senior former U.S. intelligence official once said to me that I asked him about how good is U.S. intelligence on Iran. I asked him. And he said, we're very good at picking up and finding out about clandestine nuclear facilities in Iran. We're less good at knowing what the supreme leader ate for breakfast. So we're good on kind of technical intelligence, less good on political intelligence. And so it seems to me that you're right. On all aspects of their program, they haven't put their foot on the brake. They're still doing, R&D in centrifuge workshops. But I think the pathways to a bomb, which we talk about, which are most problematic from our perspective, they don't seem to be moving forward, or if they are moving forward, they're kind of, inching forward. And it seems to me that there's a few things that would really be game changers, that would trigger a much more different policy from both Obama and Congress. One is on the level in which they're enriching. If they go beyond 20%, I think that would certainly trigger something. The other is the ad hoc facility. Moving to bring that online, I think would trigger something. And I think they seem to understand fairly well what these red lines are, so they kind of tiptoe up to the red line, but they don't cross the red line. And I would say one of the shifts in US policy over the last 4 years, and one of the major sources of tension between America and Israel with regards to Iran's nuclear program, is that in the past, the goal was to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability. And I think the goalposts have widened. I think it's no longer, if you listen to the language of US officials, it's no longer about preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capabilities, it's preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And I think this is, again, a major source of the tension between the United States and Israel. But my sense is if they're inching forward in some of these areas, they're continuing to do R&D, they don't really shutter their facilities, but they're not crossing some specific red lines. I think President Obama thinks to himself that that's not worth fighting a war over. And that's why I say I see this managed irresolution as most likely outcome. I don't know if that makes sense.
So, sort of more along that vein, a couple of points. One is that any analyst who is paying attention to Iran's nuclear program without paying attention to delivery systems and all the related technologies just isn't paying attention.
Yeah.
Enough said on that. The other is on the verb use in the context of nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Use.
Nuclear weapons are in constant use in this world. They're just not being detonated in anger.
Yeah.
They're used to make deterrent and compelling threats. And I think when we think of what a nuclear-armed Iran might be like, I think we might do well to consider the kinds of deterrent and compelling threats that it would try to make, rather than the doomsday scenario that they're just going to do bring back the 12th Imam and bomb Israel. That is a possibility, but it's one of many. Finally, I'm kind of distressed that there seems to be no credible development of a strategy of containment should the United States and its partners fail to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. I agree with your statement that Iran seems to be interested in creeping up to the line without actually crossing it. I think that if they do cross the line, they're going to try to cross it as a fait accompli. Yes, we have this thing that's already deployed, and they deploy first and then test.
Yeah, those.
Regime change, and their goal, and I think their motivation for wanting nuclear weapons, partly ideological, but mostly to deter regime change.
That may well be. Let me. You made some excellent points. Let me try to work backward to forward on the question of, what are their motivations for this nuclear program? And I think there's multiple motivations. What I find perplexing about this nuclear program in the context of the Supreme Leader's worldview is that he thinks about regime change often, and he is firmly convinced that that is the policy of the United States. And this nuclear issue is simply a pretext to pressure Iran with the goal of hastening regime change. But when he thinks about regime change, he doesn't obsess about U.S. hard power, the use of military force to unseat the Islamic Republic, Iraq style. What he obsesses about is this notion of a velvet revolution, soft revolution. What he calls, I think, kind of postmodern colonialism, that it's using Voice of America broadcasts, BBC Persian broadcasts, Hollywood. These are all big, parts of the CIA machine to unseat the Iranian regime. So, if that's your concern, it's a soft revolution. Nuclear weapons don't really help you there. That makes sense. The hard power doesn't really help you. Second, I would say that I don't want to act as if this is a settled debate in Iran, that they've settled on the policy of Japan rather than North Korea. It just seems to me up until now they've seen it in their interest at least to stop at certain points rather than moving full speed ahead. But I do remember having conversations with folks in Tehran who were implicitly arguing for the option of actually obtaining and testing a device. And the analogy which they would use, or the example that they would use, was that of Pakistan. And their takeaway, now this could be a totally wrong takeaway, but their perception of what happened in Pakistan is that once Pakistan actually obtained and tested a device, that turned outside pressure and outside sanctions into outside kind of engagement and incentives. That once Pakistan actually got a device, the world was so concerned about preventing nuclear war that we kind of rushed to engage them. So I think there's certainly folks within the Revolutionary Guards who probably believe that actually obtaining a device is paradoxically that will alleviate the pressure against Iran rather than increase it. The other example which the Supreme Leader uses is that of Libya. He said on multiple occasions that look at what happened when Gaddafi gave up his nuclear program. It made him vulnerable to NATO intervention a decade later. So, where is Gaddafi now? So I certainly, I have no hope, and I'm not sure there are people still arguing this, that Iran would be willing or capable of giving up its program. The question is, are they simply in pursuit of a capability or in pursuit of a weapon? You made a great comment about delivery system, and I think this is something which, when it's raised with the negotiating team, they like to change the subject, because they'll say, if we add this to the negotiations, then it's just going to be impossible to reach an agreement. So they're hoping this topic is simply going to go away. I should take notes from now on the questions. There was another point you made which I want to answer, but
there's no credible strategy of
containment, yeah. So what I've noticed whenever U.S. officials are asked about this question, the response is simply what Obama said in his first term, which is we have a policy of prevention, not containment. Obviously, I think that their concern is that if you start to mention the C word, that sends the signal to Tehran that the U.S. basically, if faced with a binary choice, the U.S. is making plans to acquiesce and allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. So I'm certain that many of your colleagues have in secret rooms been strategizing and planning for this. But I think in the White House and the State Department, no one even wants to talk about that. In fact, I was meeting not long ago with a White House official, and I was asking him about what happens if there isn't a deal. What you do in that event. And this was a few weeks ago. Maybe things have changed now. But he said we honestly haven't even begun talking or strategizing about that. And I suppose that their concern is that if that leaks and you send the Iranians the signal that, well, this isn't really a firm deadline, right? This isn't a take it or leave it offer, because if this deal doesn't happen by November 24th, we're already planning for fallback option of muddling through. So the big question is how seriously one takes the president's first-term threat of having a policy of prevention, not containment. I think my sense is that the Iranians at least believe that the U.S. government is really extremely interested in trying to resolve this issue and trying to reach a deal, and they're far less interested in opening up another avenue of conflict. And that may be a correct calculation or maybe a miscalculation. The last 3.5 decades of U.S.-Iran relations have shown that they've consistently miscalculated when it comes to their perceptions of what the U.S. is thinking on things. Please.
So I'd like to understand why you think that if they fail to reach an agreement in whatever deadline it is, that there's an appetite in the U.S. for going to some sort of managed resolution. Certainly there were a lot of voices back when this started saying that this was just a delaying tactic to give them more time to further their program. And so if it's shown that they aren't negotiating good faith, or there's a belief that not negotiating good faith, it seems like there'd be some compelling reasons to look at increasing sanctions and going back to option 1, not option 3.
Yeah, I think that's right. If we fail to reach an agreement on November 24th, and Iran reacts by saying, okay, we failed to reach a deal, now we're going to restart doing all those things that we stopped doing, I think that's absolutely going to trigger a new round of sanctions and punishment, not only from the US, but I think some of the international partners. If past is precedent, I don't necessarily see them doing that, though. I see them kind of, again, I think there's an interest on the part of the Supreme Leader to avoid further economic and political isolation, while at the same time, avoiding a deal which could strengthen his domestic adversary. So I think that, staying where they are behooves him. But if we fail to reach a deal come November 24th and they restart their activities, I absolutely do think that's going to trigger additional sanctions, and especially now that you have, a more GOP-dominated Senate. But frankly, there's I think two issues in U.S. domestic politics which have bipartisan consensus, and that is support for Israel's security, and the second is opposition to Iran and cynicism about kind of Iran's nuclear ambitions. So whether Republican or Democrat, some of the most outspoken proponents of the sanctions in the United States have been the Democrats. So I don't see this. Even had the midterm elections turned out differently, I don't think it would have been a huge difference on the nuclear dynamics. But this is the question, is about managed resolution. It's contingent on Iran being content on staying where it is. That's absolutely right. And it's contingent on sanctions staying where they are, meaning no additional U.S. sanctions. And I think that the way the White House will try to sell this is to say that, listen, we've made progress on one of these avenues. We've resolved this issue of Assoc, for example, but we need more time on some of the other issues. I don't think they will try to be able to sell this by saying we've reached a total impasse, we don't have any agreement, but we're just going to stay where we are. I think that both sides will have to tell their constituents in Tehran and Washington that we've made forward progress on some things, but we need more time. And I think if you're Congress, listen, this Congress was opposed to a very, relatively minor in comparison military operation against the Assad regime in Syria after Assad crossed, the red line on chemical weapons usage. So, especially now as we've opened up another front of conflict with ISIS, in Syria and Iraq, and you have the generals saying to Congress, listen, if you pass sanctions, which triggers Iran to put their foot on the gas again, this could take us back to escalation. I'm not sure that that Congress will see it fit to pass additional sanctions. Now, one of the ideas which is being talked about right now is Congress passing sanctions legislation which is deterrent in nature, which is saying, okay, Iran, if you restart doing what you were doing prior, that's going to trigger new sanctions. But if you remain where you are, there's not going to be additional sanctions.
We have time for one final question.
Iran using Kissinger's terms, Iran as a cause is bad for all our allies in the region. Iran as a nation, though, is still problematic for our Persian Gulf Arab allies. And I'm just wondering, what do you think, how much is their pushback? Because, I mean, these guys had problem with Shah as well.
Yeah.
So how much pushback do you think is there from our Arab allies against any kind of approach conflict?
Yeah, it's a great question. A friend of mine who was one of President Obama's Middle East advisors used to say that, Israel has an Islamic Republic problem. They have a problem with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Saudi Arabia has an Iran problem. Whether you have the Shah, whether you have a monarchy, whether you have the Islamic Republic, whether you have, secular democracy, Saudi Arabia, has this sense of insecurity, and they have this natural rivalry with Iran. And I think the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia at the moment has three elements to it. It's sectarian, Persian versus Arab. It's ethnic, Persian versus Arab, sectarian, Shiite versus Sunni, and ideological. You have, Western aligned, US aligned Saudi Arabia versus US Western opposed Iran. So I think like France and Germany, and Europe, Brazil and Argentina, there's this kind of natural rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is going to remain, whatever happens. And with regards to the smaller Persian Gulf countries, whether that's Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, their biggest concern, among others, is that the whole basis for their alliance with the United States is premised. It's based on this kind of mutual concerns about Iran. So if the U.S. and Iran make nice, if there's a rapprochement, then what is their value to the United States? They will feel incredibly, vulnerable if there's no longer have that kind of U.S. protectorate, and you see in Iran, which is unleashed in the region. So certainly that's going to remain. And if you talk to Saudi officials, what they will tell you is that the nuclear issue is obviously a major concern for them, but I think even more problematic for them is what they see Iran doing throughout the region. Supporting the Assad regime, supporting Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. So I see some of these issues not necessarily resolving themselves, but certainly ameliorating if you start to see in Iran which puts national interests ahead of ideological interests. Because I think if in Iran which follows national interests, I don't see supporting Shiite militia in southern Lebanon being beneficial for the security and economic welfare of Iran, Hezbollah. I don't see, supporting Palestinian rejectionists at the expense of your own kind of political and economic isolation as being in Iran's national interest. So I see a number of major things changing if you were to see an Iran which prioritizes national interests ahead of ideological interests. And some of those things would certainly improve the Iran-Saudi relationship. If you remember, the last time, during the 70s when you had the Shah in power, and it was, certainly wasn't democracy, but you had a government which I would argue did think much more in nationalistic terms rather than ideological terms. The relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia was not that bad. It wasn't wonderful. There was still a rivalry. But for the Saudis now, that's a golden era. They felt like they could work with the Shah, and there was a very interesting interview which President Obama gave to David Remnick in the New Yorker earlier this year, which you may have seen, and he was being asked about kind of his ideal scenario in the Middle East, and he talked about his hope for an equilibrium between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that a lot of these regional conflicts would not be resolved absent some type of an equilibrium between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So, I would just end by saying that I think the interesting paradox or the interesting dynamic between Iran and kind of the Persian Gulf countries is that they have this inferiority complex vis-a-vis Persians and superiority complex vis-a-vis Shia. They, as Sunni, feel themselves kind of superior to Shia. And so this is, constantly going to be a source of tension, because Iran is going to remain Persian and it's going to remain Shia despite what happens. But I truly do think that the challenges and the rivalries and the problems and the isolation that Iran is facing right now is not just because it's Iran. This is what the leadership of the Islamic Republic feels, that the world is out to get us and we're always the victim. But I think it has a lot to do with Iran's behavior. And if you started to see a different government in Iran which changed its behavior, prioritized its economic and national interests, a lot of this regional tension, again, it wouldn't be fully resolved, but a lot of it, I think, would significantly subside.